The recording. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Tuesday, April 14th Working Group Component Standard meeting. It's been a little while since we've had a meeting, so this is nice to have a couple of agenda items today. There's two we're going to talk about, and then Phoenix Blue is adding one also, so then we'll have room for more. So the first thing is I wanted to follow up and get some direction on the instance-specific config cap. I wrote this with sort of two goals. Let me share my screen here and see if it works on the web client. To Chrome tab and this one. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Great. So I wrote this cap originally with sort of two goals. One basically being to unblock component config implementations, and that's the main goal. Migrations are blocked on having a solution for fields that may need to be specific to a single instantiation of a component and not shared across pools of components. Component configs are designed typically to be shared, so that blocks those fields from being in the config. So we needed to have some way of splitting them out. This original proposal was to have two different kinds. There's been a lot of discussion around that, and I sort of summarized the discussion here in this comment. So it seems like the two options that are on the table right now are, if we define two kinds, be willing to duplicate some state between them if, for example, we have a field like a bind address that could sometimes be instance specific or sometimes be shared, and then define a merge semantic for just those two kinds. Or go a lot further and define a general merge. I think I am in the boat of option one, because it's a lot more tractable, and my goal is to unblock component config migrations. So, which would be to have an instance-specific kind and a shareable kind, and there will be some overlap in the fields, and to merge them, you take the values from the instance-specific that are in the overlap. And I wanted to see how folks feel about that.
I feel the same, and I think that this is probably the best, like the most expected by users decision.
I agree that this is a good thing to do. I think that what you say about it being practical to create a second type for the mostly instance specific things, potentially with some, key specific overrides makes sense.
Okay.
For me, it just follows apart a little bit. Like we should get the 80% thing done, and the trouble is that we're kind of already in the inertia of the existing design. When, to me, like the fact that there is a configuration, like inherently it's to give the user options, right? So these things are options that are intended to be configured, and like for the project to decide what is instance specific or node specific, like versus what should be shared and managed at a config level across the whole cluster is, like it's a little bit of a fallacy.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, as far as giving users that flexibility, and I think you're right that we are sort of in the arms of the current design, or maybe it's just that because nobody has gone ahead and defined a general merge semantic that can be used across Kubernetes, like the closest thing that exists is server-side apply, and it hasn't been, it's not like a library that's easy for everybody to consume and just do the same merge on the command line. I think it's just a lot more work at this point to do that, and so like you said, we got to be practical. And that's what I'm trying to do, is just be practical to unblock the next step of this project. But I think you're right. I do think that there's a lot of value in having a general semantic so that we don't have to make these kinds of decisions on the user's behalf.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that like providing a way for lots of components to share the same configuration, like pigeonholed us into these design decisions, because like providing that way to do that, but then not always giving users the ability to provide their own config on an instance specific level. We could have just had one API, right? And it could just have every single field in it, and that would have been an improvement over flags.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple places we allow that sort of late binding, but it's not particularly comprehensive, right? Like we have the downward API for pods. That would be one example where it's sort of templated and you get the instance specific value at the end of the day, like a pod name, for example. But yeah, you're right. It's not everywhere. And we don't have generally good solutions for that. And I think some of that might have even been intentional, just to keep things simple until it was shown necessary. But yeah, I mean, it's a totally valid point.
So with regard to creating the instance specific types, is there an example that you want to talk about? Or
no, I just wanted to get some consensus on that direction. I need to go rewrite the KEP now to actually lay that out, how that would work. Cool. So that's that one. Does anyone have anything else to say on that? I'm going to move over to Chris's.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I can think of is just instead of talking about instance specific versus like the general or shared config, that will probably be in a better place if we use the kinds that we define in the API, if they are more descriptive into the smaller unit of the thing that they try to group.
Can you give me an example of what you're thinking?
Even if it's called like options or bind options or something like that. Like if there's some general way to describe all of those things instead of just bucketing it under instance.
Yeah, I would love to have a name that is more immediately descriptive. There seem to be a variety of options that fall into this category. I haven't really come up with a better descriptor for them in that taxonomy.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing I can think of is local config, but that's just as general. So
yeah, that's what we called it even a longer time ago.
Do you expect typically that these would be coming from like the downward API? Is there anything we can pull from over there? Or
not always.
Okay.
Could be things, yeah. So like a bind address is one that is in potentially both categories, because it could just be everybody binds to all interfaces. It could be like people have specific requirements. The other common ones are things like host names and IP addresses. So there's not like a ton of them, but there are fields that are commonly set.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We talked about in the past of maybe having ways to auto detect, but there's not really reliable ways to do that.
Do you think that interface names are something that we could look into just from a standardization standpoint? Because there are, you know, with tools like systemd, like late into the boot, those things are stable. So
maybe, but I still don't know. Like we might be able to have defaults there, but they'd have to be overridable.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I always liked Docker Swarm's UX for the interface name stuff where you could pass it an IP or an interface name and it would work. But,
Yeah, but that's at least one level up in terms of indirection. So it's definitely probably better for users to just say bind to this interface name.
for most environments, that stuff is pretty usable. But
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, that sounds good. I will go refactor the cap to sort of explain the merge semantic between the two kinds, and think about naming a bit. Chris, do you want to go ahead and present?
Sure. Should I share my screen?
Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Oh, host disabled attendee sharing.
Oh, I did. All right, let me do it. I'm in the web client, so I don't know what restrictions changed.
Cool. Well, while you pull that up, in essence, what I've been doing is trying to integrate component config style configurations into controller runtime so that we can eventually get that downstreamed into things like Operator SDK and into KubeBuilder, so that we can get this more widespread into custom controllers and not just core Kubernetes components. There was an open issue from Jeff Johnson from the component or the cluster add-ons working group trying to get this going. So I started implementing a design doc for it, and we got that merged, but now we're working through the different UX of how we could implement this. I'm looking for reviews. Michael's been super wonderful in helping review where it currently is. And yeah, now I'm trying to take it to the finish line, I guess.
Cool. Do you want to take folks through some of the options that you're thinking of? And
yeah. So there's.
Feel free to tell me to go to different tabs or
Cool.
scroll or whatever.
So the beginning parts is I'm working on this as a multi-part feature. So currently in controller runtime, to actually configure the core component of it, the manager, which is what everything gets spawned off of, or all the controllers get spawned off of, you pass in an option struct, and I'm trying to keep that as a base, like almost as an internal type, which I don't like, but it'll work as a first implementation to help roll people into this. And so the first implementation is basically a new options from component config, which currently what this pull request has is you define a bunch of setters and getters for pulling out the specific manager configurations needed to configure options. And so if you look at that, you basically have controller v1 default controller configuration, and that is a type that is specific to controller runtime, but can be rewritten into your own custom type as you want to add more configuration. So if you go into files change,
Okay, files changed.
and you can go to the component config.go, which is all the setters and getters. Which Michael and I have been talking about trying to figure out a way to get rid of these. And so these currently will go through, and basically you could define your object however you want, as long as it supports these functions. We can pull out the configurations and reconfigure the options struct. If you scroll down to the actual manager.
Let's.
In line 372, just the new options for component config. Just takes in the configuration interface, which obviously expects those functions, and then just loops through every single one in here. As you scroll down, it's kind of just pulling out getters, or pulling out the setters and getters. Implementation wise, we've been talking about trying to figure out how to integrate in the API machinery conversion so that we could use an internal type and have, and correct me where I'm wrong, because this is a little bit new to me, Michael, but basically be able to pull the actual fields off as actual fields instead of using an interface and making everybody develop or write out these functions for their types.
Right. And now, like, if you had implemented this interface already on your base type, and people are directly embedding it, I don't think people are going to have to re-implement it, right? You get the methods for free.
True.
I think what I'm noticing is that, like, typically, and it's not necessarily a bad thing for you, but typically we don't have these interfaces implemented on the Go structs, right? It's just a bunch of public types, and you just like pull values off like you would any struct.
Mhm.
And so I'm just like wondering if there's a way to reduce that complexity here.
Yeah.
And I think the other side of it is, like, your intention is that users can extend this type, right, with their own options. And so that was the motivation for the interface, so that you would be able to still pass this sort of options.
Yeah. And actually, if you go back to
yeah,
if you go back to the discussion, you can kind of see an implementation of what it would look like for embedding, which is pretty simple. Which I think is the last comment that's on there right now. And because controller configuration defines the actual functions, as long as it's embedded into your type, you get access to those setters and getters, and you don't have to redefine them, as you're pointing out.
yeah. So that's one option. And I do want to say too, speaking of API machinery conversions, so it sounds like KubeBuilder does conversions a little differently. That's fine. I don't have a strong opinion on it because I'm not super familiar with what KubeBuilder does. And if you think how they do it is better, then, like, okay, maybe you do, maybe you don't. But what are the trade-offs? Because if that's a UX that people, like, who are using controller runtime are more familiar with, it might make more sense.
Yeah. So to do it that way, actually, did I put the branch in here? I think I sent it directly to you. Let me figure out how to get this to you.
Yeah, somewhere.
So I implemented using that pattern from controller runtime in KubeBuilder. And the idea there, how they do it is they basically create, sorry, I'm still trying to find it. There it is.
Their docs page looks like they pick a version as the hub. Like they pick an
do.
external version as a hub instead of having an internal. Yeah.
Yeah, which technically you don't have to. They just document it that way. So in the separate branch that I just sent you, or that I sent in Zoom, it actually sets up an internal type at just package API config instead of a version config, and it's a direct replica just like we do in normal conversions. But the difference is I specify the internal type as the hub, which is just defining a function called hub on it. And then when you want to do the conversions, you write from your version type, you have it define a converts to and a converts from. And then you're able to call those to convert an external type into an internal type. So implementation wise, it makes it so that in Manager, what we do is we can pass in the external type. And as long as the external type supports convert to the internal type, we can have any external custom type define converts to the controller runtime internal config, and then use that to
got it.
configure everything. Which
Okay. Yeah.
It's not as automated like you get out of the API machinery conversions.
Yeah. One advantage of, so for example, if you used all external types and just made one of them the hub, one advantage of that is that if ever somebody else is trying to vendor your types and do the conversions, all that machinery is public, so they can do it. That's the struggle with the internal type, is that we actually don't export those into the staging repos, and that makes it so that nobody who consumes those can actually do the conversions, and it's only the component itself, and that's led to some design discussions and no resolution.
Gotcha.
So the external only approach might actually be better in that respect.
Okay. Yeah, and I think those are kind of the three paths that we're looking at.
Okay, and I think another option we sort of tossed around yesterday was to sort of flip the embedding. So let me go back to that last example. So here we have users creating a new type in embedding the controller configuration in their type, which in this case gives them the interface. Another option is for controller configuration to embed something like raw extension, runtime.raw extension, which allows sort of an arbitrary YAML to be unpacked and pass through all the API machinery. And then we could probably give users a convenient way to ask that that YAML be extracted per API machinery into their custom type, so that actually sort of keeps the two types separate and provides a generic extension point on your generic type. You'd still have the type safety of passing your thing around for things you're using it for, and then users would be able to extract into their types. So that's another option.
Oh, I see. So I think I was a little bit confused when we were talking about that. So the idea would be the generic controller type would have a separate field that would be runtime.raw extension that custom types could be passed into, not this type. I see. Okay, that was what you were getting at by saying flip
Got
it.
it.
Okay.
Yeah.
What would that, because we would have to put a JSON tag on that field, right? I've never seen that. How does that work? Like from a user standpoint?
I think you just make it a runtime.raw extension and it has a field name. It's not embedded. It's like you'd actually give it a field name and then you just JSON tag it the same name.
Like controller spec or something like that, and then everything
Custom
underneath
config or something.
Yeah, or you just call it like extensions or extension or something.
Yeah. Okay.
That implies, and then we have documentation that says, okay, like this should also be a Kubernetes object. It should have all the metadata, et cetera, et cetera. And then what happens is, so this is where you'd have to like kind of check with API machinery to see if it would work if you chose the external only approach, because the docs for runtime.raw extensions say that it should be runtime.object on the internal type. So that might be tricky if you're only converting between externals, but it might also just pass through between externals. So that's something to test and verify. Let me see if I can actually pull it up here.
I can drop the link that you sent me in the Zoom if that helps.
Yeah, that'd be super helpful. Thanks.
Yep. That's done.
So here the plugin is something that controller runtime could generate per project, the plugin type that ends up being what's contained inside of the extension.
So a custom a controller author could implement their own component config type for their custom configs and pass it into that object, or have that in their YAML definition.
Here, I got it.
I'll be completely honest and say, since we talked about this last night, I haven't done enough research to give that one a good.
Yeah, that's fair. I think it's probably worth just like poking a few of these.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know, throw a quick Google Doc or Markdown file together and just lay out the trade-offs, like pros, cons of each.
Mhm.
Don't spend like too much time on it because we want to unblock you, but that's probably just useful as a historical artifact of why we decided to do whatever we decide.
I feel
Yeah, that's
my initial gut reaction to this is that I like inlining the JSON tags, inlining the type more, and then just keeping the fields the same for everybody. But that gets tough if you want to edit the manager or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Lee. And Chris, I had some thoughts on that too, which was that I think one of the other stated reasons for the interface is like people who have sort of arbitrary ways they want to structure their configurations,
mhm.
which is actually, it's probably an anti-pattern. And, you know, in most cases, it's not going to be that different.
Yeah. I'm just. I wonder if there'll be anybody that comes through and says, "All right, I don't really like the leader election config that comes out of component base or what have you, any of the embedded types." Like, if they
Yeah, I
would
mean,
want to
nothing
go through.
stops them from duplicating it in their type.
True.
Yeah, although they would have to plumb their new type all the way through to the manager.
I think that's true in either case,
Yeah.
right?
Should we provide one of those raw extension points directly within the controller configuration, even if it's inline?
I doubt you can inline it because of type meta, because it would
Yeah.
overlap.
Yeah.
No,
It's
what I'm
it's
saying
not.
is-
It's so raw extension is this. It's basically a raw byte plus an object.
yeah,
So it might work as far as inlining, but I think it's weird to have a field called raw and a field called object just inlines in every.
yeah. What I was really more getting at was, oh well, yeah. I was thinking controller configuration extension as like a field name or something that's optional. Basically, I was saying we could do both. So that you wouldn't have to change any of the generated code that controller runtime creates for putting together the manager, but then you could get your own custom types plugged in to that extension if you needed to do things inside of the manager main without changing
Mhm.
managers and stuff like that.
I think we want the custom type to basically be a pass through to the controller that's implemented off of manager, right,
Mhm.
Chris? Like the users implementing a controller just call something to extract their thing off of it, whether it's a type switch or like an extract from raw extension.
Yeah. I mean, if we use the interface, or if we use the interface and basically have the functions defined to pull out the parameters that we need for options, all you have to do is pass in the actual whatever your custom type is, and it gives you or it'll hydrate or populate all the fields for you based on the decoding, and it seems like it gives you everything that we'd want to be able to move forward, and we'd have the populated options, and we'd have a populated component config type that I'm just trying to
I mean,
weigh
you
and
can do
balance.
it. I think you can do it either way, and that's so we can't make a decision just on like, oh, you can do it this way and you can't do it the other way. It's going to have to be more nuanced on like what's easy for us to reason about, what's simpler in code, like what do users expect. you know, what's more abstract or less abstract. It's going to be like sort of value judgments like that. So I think that's where it's useful to have a doc where we can argue about this.
Yeah, that's a good takeaway. Okay. Cool. Well, if anybody else is on the call that wants to look at this and provide some input as well, I'm always open to hear other thoughts, but I'll definitely put together a Google Doc so we can talk through these ideas.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. This is really awesome. I'm very excited about this as a direction.
Me too. I think it'll be really fun.
Cool. All right. We're definitely over time. So thanks everyone. Take care.